Thank you so much, Louise, for your kind introduction and for the kind welcome that I've enjoyed today from your students and colleagues. And it is truly an unusual pleasure to be back here in this building, although this particular part of the building didn't exist at the time. Just across the hallway where I had some of my first music history training from Professor Stein. Unknown to me at the time because I was a viola major and I was trying to act cool. I remember very clearly Louise ordering me into her office after my first midterm, on which I got a grade with a B and a minus after. She said, "You could do better than this." I remember, yeah, I think she was right. It took a while for the message to sink in and some wandering, but I hope that I haven't let her down too badly. We could, but we won't. So I'm very pleased also, I'm very grateful that the original invitation to be here from the Confucius Institute came from Joseph Lamb, who heard me speak last year and has been helpful to me on the one or other detail in the meantime. And I am a newcomer to Chinese music, I should admit right away. And what I'm going to do today, I've been a bit naughty and changed the title of my talk a bit. All the bit about A.B. Marx is still going to be there, so if you came here for the Hegel and the A.B. Marx, be patient, we will get to that. But I decided it would be more interesting probably for a general musicological audience to speak on a wider frame, so a bit more synoptically about the reception of Chinese music in Germany. And so I've taken essentially parts of two chapters of my book and combined them into one presentation. That also reflects my interest in German national identity. So there's going to be quite a lot of Germany here, or actually far more Germany than China, as you will see. So history writing requires imagination. The imagination to choose what stories to tell, and the imagination to frame them. By framing, I mean deciding on the reason you're telling a story. This evening I want to explore how Western, particularly German music historians around 1800 drew China into the field of their historical imagination. Such historians used Chinese music, about which they had recently acquired substantial amounts of information, if not direct experience, thanks to the writings of missionaries and diplomats. They used this information to frame themselves on the wider canvas of world music history. So my talk is structured around two historians of music, Johann Nikolaus Forkel, with the wig, and Adolf Bernhard Marx. And I'm going to ask two overall questions about them. The first is, how does their construction of Chinese music history reveal something about their self-positioning as Germans? Yeah? Germans for whom being musical was a key point of national self-identification at the time, and I would argue up to the present day. And second, I want to ask, how did their creation of knowledge about China shape or even inaugurate colonialist strategies of doing music history, strategies that are now at the center of renewed attention in musicology and in our sister field, ethnomusicology. So my talk will have a simple structure, I hope. I'm going to talk a bit at first about the idea of the German imaginary. Then I'm going to turn to Forkel's rather fantastical take on China. Then, for you Hegel fans who have been waiting for weeks, there will be a section about A.B. Marx, Hegel, and Chinese music history. And finally, I'm going to conclude with some words about what it means to strategically forget something. So 18th and 19th century Western reflections on China are not really about China at all, for the most part. And this indeed, in many fields, is one of the main points in Edward Said's celebrated analysis of Western constructions of the East. This is certainly true of the two historians I'm going to discuss here, who, as I will show, use their writings about China to position themselves as Germans, whatever that may mean, against China, a gigantic empire at the other end of the world, with its own 4,000-year music history. Forkel and Marx's engagement with Chinese music and its history offers valuable insights into formulations of German national identities in music. The current scholarly consensus about German national identity in music emerged more than a decade ago in Pamela Potter and Celia Applegate's edited collection, Music and German National Identity. Many of you will know it. The idea of Germanness in music, or more precisely, the special musicality of the Germans, or so Applegate and Potter argued, emerged in a process that began in the early decades of the 18th century and reached its peak intensity in the middle of the 19th. Historians can find this idea in a network of texts that develop a common theme, namely that the German musical nation presages, comes before, predicts even, the actual one. German musicality, or German musical Germanness, manifested itself musically in writings about music and in making music, in ways of thinking about music, in discourses about music that took as their theme the collision between horizontal and vertical musical structures, emotional inwardness and outward sophistication, culture and civilization, and irrationality and rationality. All of these, sort of the battle between these two, the dialectic, if you will, were tied supposedly to a specific sensibility found where there are Germans, a sensibility that in turn informed the establishment of a canon of musical works whose universal value transcends national labeling. This sleight of hand, this replacement of the national with the universal is not at all limited to music, of course. Particular German structures of doing philosophy, for instance, and natural science, designing universities, are also widely regarded to embody universal values. The universal German national music aesthetic was so solid by the middle of the 20th century that an entire celebrated novel, Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, could be built around it. Now, some associate this kind of thinking with something called the Deutsche Sonderweg, the German special path. That's the idea that Germany's strength in the arts and culture and philosophy, but its weakness in democracy, paved the way for the barbarism of the 20th century. That's actually one of the messages of Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, and not directly on the back of the novel, but in the writings of social historians after the Second World War, there was a proposal that there's something special about Germany that made it the way it was. Now, this thesis, the Sonderweg thesis in modern German history, has been largely discredited, although it remains a powerful explanatory tool because it is difficult to shake loose the idea that there is something different and even alarming, well, not even definitely alarming, about the course of German history from 1789 to 1945. Now, in the realm of music, the Sonderweg idea remains largely unchallenged. Recent sharp interventions in academic circles aside, which I by no means wish to brush away, I think it's fair to say that German cultural products such as Beethoven symphonies, for instance, continue to enjoy unparalleled international, or one might say universal prestige, especially in places like China. Yet in all of the critical discussion of Germanness in music, Germany's others are invariably Germany's European neighbors, like France, oh yes, France, or Britain, das Land ohne Musik, where I currently work. At a stretch, you might find the United States in this comparison. 18th and 19th century encounters with the non-European world, between the non-European world and Germany, figure not at all. So what follows is a discussion of how two major contributors to the discourse of German music's universal values, Forkel and Marx, used China, which they knew to be a rival to any claims of universality on a global scale, to frame their discussions about what good music is and how it should be studied. Forkel's Chinese fancy. Johann Nikolaus Forkel, originally from a shoemaker's family in Coburg, which is now in Bavaria, but at the time was in Thuringia, arrived in Göttingen in 1768, that's Göttingen in the mid-18th century, to study law at the expense of an aristocratic patron. The newly founded Georg August Universität was a center of scientific and historical innovation. So it was one of the several university centers of innovation. Terrible word actually. It's quite loaded now, but of doing things in a new way. Halle was the first, and Göttingen was the second. Let's say Berlin was the third. Forkel soon moved to so just about their innovations. I was reading the other day what was innovative. So, for instance, the seminar was first pioneered in Göttingen. The idea that students would be given the opportunity to take a source or a text and teach everybody, including the professor, was first done in Göttingen. A library where students could borrow books. Yeah? All of this plays a role in Forkel's in the formation of his outlook. Now, Forkel soon moved away from the law towards music and replaced his princely scholarship with wages as an organist and music director at the university church. And as he moved from formal study to permanent employment, he eventually became the university's first overall director of music. He made contacts both among his professors and among literati his own age. These included members of the Göttinger Hain, so a radical group of expressive German poets who were in Göttingen at the same time. Now, while still a student, Forkel steered a course between the two camps. As a scholar with ambitions for an academic career, he modeled his writing on the groundbreaking work of his history professors, historians like August Ludwig Schlözer, who was the founder of a new universal approach to history, who taught the history of the world altogether. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave Schlözer out of it from here on, although you can read the book next year and find out more. But as a man of literature, and it's very important that Forkel saw himself in both positions, as a man of literature, he propelled himself onto a national literary stage. But what nation? Politically, most German-speaking lands were united in the Holy Roman Empire. There's the Holy Roman Empire, whose venerable institutions, so it was founded in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, proved remarkably resilient at holding together a geographically and religiously diverse collection of states, some rather tiny. That's Germany. It's important to remember that that's not something else. That's Germany. Now, the Reich was prone to bouts of instability, particularly when its two largest constituents, Austria and Prussia, came to blows, as they did in the 1760s in the 7 Years' War. Nonetheless, a community of readers, a community of literary consumers were busy reading a new Germany into existence in the shadow of explosive growth in the market for printed books. Changes in the way books were sold led to better incentives for authors and a steep rise in the number of books on the market. So books were not sold on commission like they are today. The booksellers couldn't return the ones they didn't sell. And that was another innovation of the German mid-18th century. This really caused an explosion in the number of printed books that you could buy, which stimulated the growth of a reading public, which demanded in turn yet more books. And so one product this public favored was the genre of the almanac. We know Poor Richard's Almanac, which is from the same era. A collection of loosely related reviews, reports, anecdotes, stories. Now, after having tried his luck editing a more old-fashioned journal, Forkel turned to the almanac genre in 1779, eventually producing 4 annual volumes filled with reviews, letters to correspondents, lists of musicians. So when I was being trained as a Mozart scholar, what we did was we looked in the Forkel almanacs to see who was playing second bassoon in the court of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. That was really important, and we knew because Forkel told us. And his musical almanacs for Germany, that's what they were called, were evidently a success. Items from them were frequently plagiarized, and after a few years, they even inspired a series of parodies. So there was some guy who was actually printing fake almanacs that were based on Forkel's ones. Now, these have unfortunately not been digitized by anybody, so I have to find one because I would be very curious to see what the fake almanac looks like that corresponds to the one I'm about to tell you about. So the last item in the 1784 volume, which came out at the end of 1783, it's Auf das Jahr, 1784, is Forkel's review of the Jesuit Joseph Marie Amiot's lengthy report on Chinese music. There's Amiot for you, which is called Mémoire sur la musique des Chinois tant anciens que modernes, which was published in Paris in 1778 as the 6th volume of a large encyclopedia from China. Amyot had lived in Beijing since the 1740s, where he occupied a number of prominent court positions and had the confidence of the Qianlong emperor. In the West, he was well known as an expert on such diverse areas as military strategy. He contributed the first translation of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and on the Manchu language. Now, that was very important because he was the first European who created a dictionary of the Manchu language, and that was, of course, the language of the Chinese imperial court, because the Chinese emperors were not Han Chinese, they were Manchu. He also enjoyed a reputation in French musical circles for his knowledge about the practices and history of music in China. And this contribution was awaited for a long time because his work had been circulating in manuscript up until that point. This contribution was actually edited by the music historian Pierre Roussier, as we shall see, for his own polemical purposes. The overall tone of Forkel's review of the memoir is disappointment. How is it, he asks, and I quote, that a people in the first development of the arts promises such excellent perspectives, and despite these attractive perspectives, always remain at one point? The rest of the essay, which starts there and runs for 41 pages, swerves between Forkel's perplexity about Chinese music's evident power over its listeners, to detailed accounts of Amyot's findings, and obvious efforts to instrumentalize Chinese music history for his own purposes. It is a frustrating text. The reader is often not informed when Forkel moves between his own ideas and ideas that he's citing, which is tricky in a review. The result is a kind of semi-plagiarized cut-and-paste job, where the border between criticism, citation, borrowing, and original thinking is blurred. And this is how Forkel worked in all of his writings. So the general history of music, the Allgemeine Geschichte der Musik, is exactly the same. It's full of long passages of plagiarized from Burney that he never meant, that he doesn't admit. There's a wonderful book by my former colleague in Würzburg, Oliver Wiener, about Forkel's textual strategies, which I recommend to you if you can read German. Forkel's first task in his review is to place Amyot's writings in the context of debates about the origins of human music. Amyot's work had in fact already appeared in these debates. In the early 1750s, Amyot's reports of Chinese music history circulated in Paris in manuscript, where they came to the attention of Jean-Philippe Rameau. Now, Rameau recognized, or thought he recognized, in Amyot's transcription of Chinese scales, the so-called triple geometric progression. That is the generation of pitch material by perfect fifths. Now, I barely can talk about such complicated matters as the triple progression, but I must tell you about them because it's an interesting part of my story. Rameau saw these as evidence. Saw this as evidence of the common origin of Chinese and ancient Greek musical practice. He actually claimed that Noah must have shipped aboard the ark carrying a lyre tuned in perfect fifths. Roussier, Amyot's later editor, took Rameau to task and claimed instead that Chinese music was a bastardization of Egyptian music. Amyot, finally back in Beijing, rejoined the discussion in the memoir by claiming that Chinese music theory, which was demonstrably very old, was the origin of both the Egyptian and the Greek. Now, Forkel sides here, perhaps slightly sarcastically, with Amyot, concluding that Pythagoras, who had been to India, must also have been in China, where he then brought back the triple progression. Forkel concerned himself, however, with more than questions of origin. He was also interested in how music worked on Chinese listeners. Thus, he devotes several pages at the beginning of the review to Amyot's report of how a performance of Rameau's harpsichord music had had no effect whatsoever on the Chinese. Amyot cites a Chinese official who claims that the Chinese vastly preferred the simpler, non-contrapuntal, non-harmonic music of their ancients. In the European 1770s, a story like this could have had only one context. That is the Carreau des Buffons, in which Rousseau argued simultaneously for the lost authentic music of the ancients and the heartfelt vocal simplicity of mid-century Italian opera. I would be very proud of myself if that was an original insight, but Phil Bowman wrote about this in the 1980s, and no one really seems to have picked up on it. But the idea that discussions of Chinese music were always about the Carreau, and particularly the idea of an axis of simple music and complex music. Now, Forkel finds a way to discuss this that makes it possible for him to convey reports of the power of ancient Chinese music without having to subscribe to the rhetoric of decline. That's his challenge, the decline brought on by civilization. He writes, "One can see from this that all nations have one fable regarding the wonderful power of music, and that one does not need to believe the Chinese fable any more than the Greek one." Forkel then continues with an account based on Amyo of Chinese theories about the origins of music and the sounds of nature, a description of the Chinese theory of the division of the octave, the 12 lu, a listing of different classes of instruments, and a discussion of whether the Chinese knew counterpoint. He then turns to contemporary Chinese musical practice. Now here, Forkel departs from Amyo and introduces long quotations from Chinese authorities, one from the Emperor Kangxi himself, the grandfather of the Qianlong Emperor who was then reigning, the Emperor Kangxi himself, and the other an unnamed Mandarin. Now, I've searched for months for the source of these quotations without any success. Now, although I can't be sure, you can never be sure, you can't prove a negative, as I was taught in graduate school, my current working assumption is that Forkel simply made them up, even if they're loosely based on recent events. So Forkel introduces, I'm going to call him pseudo-Kangxi. I've always wanted to write that. I've never been a medievalist, but I'm able to call someone pseudo something. So introduces pseudo-Kangxi, that's the real one, in order to return to the question of the Chinese rejection of Western music. He begins with the Kangxi Emperor's attraction to Western music. Kangxi's extensive interactions in the early 18th century with Western musicians in Beijing have been described extensively in recent years, so I won't describe them further here. In Forkel's telling of the story, Kangxi was so enthusiastic about what he heard from the missionaries that he decided to order everyone in China to adopt European music and musical instruments. But he soon realized that in their hearts, Chinese musicians, quote, preferred their own ancient music. As Forkel puts it, stubbornness was preferred to truth, and prejudice hindered conviction. Unwilling to upset his subjects the way his Manchu ancestors had by forcing them to adopt the Manchu fashion of wearing one's hair in a queue, Kangxi gave up. That's Forkel's theory. To go ahead, Forkel writes, would have amounted to placing his subjects in the position of having to disobey him in a matter about the value of which had not yet been decided. Forkel then cites a decree of pseudo-Kangxi, reorganizing the Chinese musical life by ordering the improvement of the instruments that were already there. Now, parts of these are taken actually from Amyo's discussion of musical reforms that had happened many, many years previously. Now, I am aware that the real Kangxi did take a great interest in music, and that he did attempt fundamental reforms. Forkel is somehow vaguely aware of these, but I cannot for the life of me figure out how he would have had direct information about them except through Amyo, and they do not appear. So Forkel's speculation about the capacity for a people to change their musical lives on orders from above would have struck a chord with his readers. In 1780, on the death of his mother Maria Theresia, the Holy Roman Emperor and Austrian Archduke Joseph II acquired political control over the Habsburg lands, most of which were sort of in Austria. He immediately unleashed a significant series of reforms in the geographical areas over which he had control, including the abolition of serfdom, dissolution of the monasteries, the introduction of universal education, and significant changes to the structure of his government. There's Joseph II at the keyboard with his sisters. And this is a pamphlet, sorry, the screen is very large, a bit pixelated. That's a pamphlet about the dissolution of the monasteries. And you can see sort of there's monks down at the bottom with money bags, and he's standing over the top with a kind of Masonic symbol. His reforms also included, as some of you will know, profound interventions in matters of musical practice, most notably the removal of most instrumental music from the Catholic liturgy and the establishment of a national theater in Vienna meant to foster German language music drama. So as I mean, Mozart's biography is very much affected by both of those reforms. None of Forkel's readers would have missed the parallel between pseudo-Kangxi and Joseph, especially because Joseph and his older contemporary and rival, Frederick the Great of Prussia, had occasionally allowed themselves to be styled as European equivalents of the Chinese emperors, whom European sinophiles often held up as paragons of wise and enlightened rule. Forkel's appropriation of Kangxi reflects the musical concerns then of a greater Germany. So this is a famous, after-the-fact picture from the 19th century of Frederick the Great playing the flute in Sanssouci. Can't really see the chinoiserie so well in the background, but there's plenty of it. And I think there's an interesting, it's interesting to think about the parallels between Kangxi, Joseph, and Frederick in a kind of a global way. And Frederick was a massive enthusiast of China, and he built this tea house, the famous tea house in the park. The golden figures all around it are all musicians, and they play invented medieval instruments. It's a paper all for itself. Now Forkel continues his discussion with two general observations. Chinese music is always slow, and the Chinese, even though they're equipped by their music theory to divide the octave into semitones, did not use semitones in their musical practice. Forkel ascribes this to what he imagines to be a slow, ascribes what he imagines to be a slow and harmonically monotonous music to the Chinese love of simplicity, of Einfalt. Forkel gestures here again to contemporary aesthetic debates, as becomes clear in the paragraphs that follow. To make his point, he cites over 3 pages an unnamed Chinese expert on music. Now, as with Pseudo Kangxi's decree, this quotation is nowhere to be found in Amio and seems to be an invention. Forkel's imaginary Mandarin defends Chinese music against the charge of monopoly. He claims that European music is too fast. If the intention is to prove that European musicians have greater skill in moving their fingers quickly, he argues, then he will gladly admit European superiority. If the intention, however, is to demonstrate that all listeners must take pleasure from such skill, then the Mandarin must disagree. Chinese listeners find European pieces too long and too quick. Chinese ears do not tolerate confusion. Musical impression, in order to be effective, need to be able to reach listeners without struggle and effort. The critical Mandarin then compares the experience of listening to European music with an attempt by a Chinese artist to demonstrate, quote-unquote, all that is interesting in the history of 22 Chinese dynasties in one painting, or, even worse, to depict the same history on hundreds of smaller paintings, and then to display them one after the other. In both cases, the truth of the painting's expression, that's a quote, and its beauties would be lost. So after letting this imaginary witness speak at some length, Forkel dismisses him. He says, the Chinese are victims of the prejudices of an upbringing that teaches them that everything that is truly good can be found with them, and that the music invented by their forefathers is the most perfect in the world. They allow further their unrefined and blunt organs to be the judges of their feelings, and would truly laugh at us were we to want to convince them that their music, in order to be good, should be constructed according to the rules that we in Europe observe. Forkel's Mandarin speaks the language of German music aesthetics from the 1760s onwards. The comparison of music, a narrative art, with painting, a static one, recalls Gottfried Ephraim Lessing's comparison of poetry and painting. Poetry unfolds over time, Lessing famously argued. Paintings project bodies into space. In addition, the repeated appearance of the word Einfalt, simplicity, in relation to Chinese music, evokes Lessing's critique of the art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann's enthusiasm about the edle Einfalt, the noble simplicity of the ancient Greeks. Finally, the defense of musical simplicity evokes, as we saw before, never-ending querelle in European music theater, which, particularly as the 18th century went on, took on a national tinge, often French versus Italian. German writers found themselves looking for a middle way. Their alternative to simplicity was not complexity, but instead the union of simplicity and diversity, as evidenced, for instance, by the craze in Germany for the English landscape garden, or the music of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who Forkel much admired. Indeed, readers of the 1784 Almanac could hardly have failed to notice the connection between Forkel's effusive praise of Bach's second set of sonatas for Kinder and Liebhaber, which are reviewed in the beginning of the volume at some length, and his dismissal of Chinese music's supposed exaggerated simplicity at the end. In this extensive and well-known essay, the essay about the Kinder and Liebhaber sonatas, Forkel makes the case for a music that combines ingenious design and simplicity of expression. Now, to argue for a union of the simple and the complex in art, as the literary historian Stefan Martus has recently put it, was to argue for a political solution to the problem of Germany that involved a strong, wise emperor king, like Joseph, Friedrich, Kangxi, yeah, and respect for the diversity of the German-speaking nation. Indeed, Forkel's associates in Göttingen were making the same arguments using Klopstok's poetry, with his associates in the Göttinger Heim. Confronted with Chinese music, Forkel shaped the music material before him to the point of making some of it up, in order to frame the encounter according to the expectations of his readers. He made an answer to a global problem, why do different cultures hear music differently, relevant to local questions, and used China to suggest a German special path, a Sonderweg. Likewise, in his unacknowledged references to the Kangxi Emperor's musical forms, which Forkel clearly recognized as enlightened, Forkel was willing to allow the Chinese a voice, however attenuated or indeed imaginary, in a debate about Germany. Much has been written about Adolf Bernhard Marx, who's probably remembered today most for his work as an analyst of musical form. Like Forkel, originally a law student, Marx, a convert from Judaism, arrived in Berlin in 1824 and soon left the law for life as a music journalist. In 1825, he founded the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. It was modeled on Friedrich Rochlitz's Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung in Leipzig. Rochlitz's journal, founded in 1797, did much to establish the critical reputations of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, although Rochlitz was not always enthusiastic about them. But in the pages of his journal, overall, one can see the beginnings of a critical reputation. In fact, E.T.A. Hoffmann's very famous essay on Beethoven specifically appeared in the pages of the Leipziger Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. And what Rochlitz did was he placed these composers in the context of philosophical idealism. There's a long essay about the history of German music by an unknown fellow named Triest, which makes quite Kantian claims about the emergence of a specific German musical style, and thereby placing these three composers into a relationship with a growing German national sentiment. Following in Rochlitz's footsteps, Marx set out to form critical opinion in favor of more profound genres such as German instrumental music and vocal music by, I have to put this in scare quotes, German masters of the past. For instance, Handel, who we all know is a British composer of German birth. Well, that's what it says in the Grove's Dictionary, and it's right. Marx became a key protagonist of Beethoven reception during the composer's lifetime, I think prompting Beethoven once to remark that he hoped he could live up to all the hype. In addition, as a member of Mendelssohn's circle, Marx helped prepare the way for the young composer's revival of Johann Sebastian Bach's Matthäus Passions in Matthew Passion in 1829. Marx used the pages, in fact, of the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung to prepare his readers for Mendelssohn's performance of the work with the Berlin Singakademie, an amateur musical organization that had been led for years by Carl Friedrich Zelter, friend of Goethe, and Mendelssohn's teacher. Marx certainly profited from the success of this and other projects he supported in his journal, and in 1830, he closed the journal and was appointed to a professorial position, the first professorial position for a musician at the University of Berlin. Now, Marx campaigned unceasingly against the supposed shallowness of the music he loved. And a lot of the time, that music was Italian opera. Not always, he was fond of Spontini, but it was often Italian music, and it was often Rossini. Although Marx himself never conceived of the two kinds of music as a binary opposition, bad music, good music, what we feel about it, it later was constructed as that, and he did integrate the two into a conflict that formed part of a deeply Hegelian theory of music history that he had actually laid out in the pages of the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. Now, indeed. So now, if you came for that, there you go, here he is. Indeed, Marx, who heard the philosopher lecture in Berlin throughout the latter half of the 1820s, was one of the earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of Hegelian thinking in music history. Marx employed Hegelian terminology on two levels. First, he positioned his own critical project as a dialectical answer to Rothwitz's Kantian allgemeine musikalische Zeitung. In Hegelian terms, he saw his own work as evidence of a new phase of the musical spirit's continuing journey towards better understanding of itself. Now, that's a key way of talking about Hegel. It's the first time I've said it. It's not the last time I'm going to say it in the next 10 minutes. If you want to read your way into Hegel's theory of history, you have to get used to a kind of inanimate agency, or animate agency on the part of something called the spirit. Yeah? That is the driver of the whole thing. The second thing he did was he used the pages of the Berliner Musikalische Zeitung to Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung to propose a theory of music broadly analogous to Hegel's outline of world history. So Hegel sort of had a three-part, a lot of things in Hegel have three parts. So there's like a three-part model of world history. In the beginning there is one ruler, and then there are several rulers, and then there are the people who rule. Those are the three phases. In the fourth volume of the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, Marx outlined a history of music, which he at first limited to the West, in three periods, which he names as church, feudalism, and people. These he links overtly to general and political context. And just as an aside, can I say the whole thing in the new musicology about the abstraction of music from society, Marx didn't think that. A.D. Marx, obviously Karl, whatever. A.D. Marx didn't think that. He was a true Hegelian, believes that society and its art forms are deeply entwined. In the first of his periods, the church period, consciousness of music was limited to the theories, techniques, and genres required to serve religion. Composers did not require what he called a higher erudition or a justification of their work before the free world spirit. In the next phase, musicians became aware of the sensual qualities of what they were doing, with the result that music served an increasingly refined needs of aristocratic patrons. So he writes, in the place of the beautiful and true, which would have been the case in the earlier phase, the unusual came to the fore. Finally, as humanity achieved more political freedom, a third age emerged in which the musical artist turns inwards in his creations, yeah? To a deeper spirit, and outwards to a wider public of free citizens who gather together in new institutions that make and experience music collectively. Now let's guess where that would have been. The current bearer of that new spirit was, of course, Prussia. I'll just step out of my text here for a moment to say that obviously the Holy Roman Empire, which had played a role in what I spoke about before, ceased to exist in 1806, somewhat stubbornly. It took a while for it to kind of finally peter out. And in the era that Marx was working, the Prussian state was trying to establish itself as a sort of a leader, generations, but trying to establish itself as a leader of Germany. Now, Celia Applegate has written extensively about A.B. Marx and how his Berlin journalism, as she says, falls within the nation-making project of German cultural exploration. And it's also kind of funny that he praises Friedrich Wilhelm III as an enlightened ruler in democracy, which is sort of like stepped on everybody. But that might have been for the censor. Now, I've lingered over Marx's political, cultural, and philosophical contexts for so long because they shape his approach to Chinese music very profoundly. So now I'll turn to his article on China in Gustav Schilling's Enzyklopädie der gesamten musikalischen Wissenschaften oder Universal-Lexikon der Tonkunst, which appeared in stages between 1835 and 1838. The volume in which the article appears, the second, came out in late 1835. So Marx must have written it in 1833, 1834, I presume. Marx opens cautiously, suggesting that it would be wrong to dismiss Chinese music as childish or even humorous, although he does end up dismissing it as childish in the end. I'll give that away. On the contrary, he argues, it can absolutely have artistic meaning for Europeans. His readers ought even to find grounds for more serious interest. Indeed, an effort to find the quote-unquote basis and beginning of all things must lead to China, because, quote, here and nowhere else we find the beginnings of musical art in Tonkunst. China is the place, quote, where the human spirit, there's that spirit again, brought the syllables and sounds of nature, which had been up until then unreliable expressions of unconscious instinct, into a rational order, retained them, and used them for rational and artistic purposes. For more than 4,000 years, music in China had been the object of state policy. For almost 3,000 years, the Chinese had a written system. After making an unfavorable comparison with Indian claims to musical antiquity, which Marx thinks were unreliable, he says, oh, you ask someone in Hindustan, and then you ask someone in Bengal, and they all have different ideas. But the Chinese, there's only one story. He reports that the contemporary Chinese prefer the music of their past to that of their present. So he's actually also depending on Amio quite clearly in his writings here. They are even in a position to prove this with reference to an enormous literature of writing about music. It is particularly striking how much more the Chinese know about their ancient music than the Europeans know about the Greeks, Marx points out. Indeed, Marx advises deep sympathy for the ancient Chinese spirit, which, quote, thousands of years ago on the shore of a distant eastern sea sought itself, examined itself, and attempted to understand itself in the murmur of the Yellow River, in the magic flutes, he really writes that psalm flute, the magic flutes of nature and the wisdom of its living language. In this, nothing separates the Chinese from Germans, who do the same, quote, in our groves, in the organ sounds of our cathedrals, and the soulful words of our language. But these beginnings, quote, have not led anywhere. The Chinese person has remained stationary where he stood millennia ago. Chinese music in Marxist reading has not undergone the dialectical process necessary for progress as it had in the West. It is trapped outside of history in the religious stage he describes in the 4th volume of the Berliner Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. Yet it lives close by. Its basic sound, its Grundklang, is readily available to most readers, who can awaken their sympathies for Chinese music simply by sitting at the piano and playing the simple melodies of the Scots. The entirely imaginary idea that Chinese and Scots music were somehow related actually runs all the way through 18th century literature on world music. Its source, there's an excellent book about this, its source seems to be Charles Burney, who built on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's entirely positive association of musical simplicity with purity of expression and culture. When Burney first encountered transcriptions of Chinese scales, he noted their similarities to Scots ones and assumed that China and Scotland must represent earlier stages in the world history of music. Now, this is something I've written about somewhere else. Burney went on this decades-long search for evidence about Chinese music, especially around the question of whether or not Chinese musicians know and use semitones. If they did, they wouldn't sound like Scots. Amio, of course, well, I mean, you know, but I'm sorry, it's very easy. So I shouldn't do this. Has anybody read the recent essay by Nick Matthew about court historicism? Yeah? It's really, really easy to set up a silly story from the early 19th century and play it for a laugh. And I've been playing this one for a laugh for a while now. It is a thought of enormous explanatory power. So Matthew Gelbart's book about the invention of broken art music really goes into it, and I highly recommend that book to you. Now, obviously, Amio had made no such claims. Marx has taken this in from some other discourses. Marx's gesture towards Scotland begins with a positive suggestion that experiencing pentatonic song and arrangements at the piano might enhance European sympathy for a faraway music. But his position also signals to the reader that such limited music must inevitably fail the test of music history itself. Marx's sympathies for Chinese music decreases as the article, which is only 6 pages long, is much shorter than Forkel's, as it progresses. After noting Chinese music's supposed Scots Celtic affinities, Marx briefly summarizes Amio's account of the mythical origin of music in Chinese culture from birdsong, before explaining with the help of a table Chinese music theory's cosmological basis. There follows a short description of Chinese musical notation, again following Amiot closely. He notes that the scale examples given by Amiot, the pentatonic row F, G, A, B, D, F, corresponds precisely to its Scots equivalent, although, quote, the more excitable Northern Europeans managed to find a more soulful dictus, the word is schwung, a more soulful dictus and powerful rhythm. Sticking close to Amiot's text, he then describes later pentatonic scales built on different pitches, noting that the Chinese, quote, date the decline of their music to the time when musicians ceased to be loyal to the old scales. He concludes his discussion with a summary of the types of Chinese musical instruments, noting the deep thought that must have gone into the creation of a system with so many opportunities to experiment with tone color. And just at this point, Marx cuts the discussion off. It's not important, he writes, quote, to consider details of the Chinese orchestra further, since in the main, the key contribution of the Chinese in the area of musical art is the invention and safekeeping of a musical system. Their instruments sound together, or one after the other, in part only to provide the fullness of sound that the Chinese, like all the peoples of the colorful Orient, require, in part on mystical religious grounds or on simply ceremonial ones. Quote. He concludes that, quote, further information about present musical practices in China is of interest not to music history, but at most to the study of folklore. After a few suggestions for further reading, Marx brings the entry to a close. Marx's assignment of the study of Chinese music to folklorists fits his Hegelian framework. Marx's Hegelianism works on both historical and analytical levels. The same spirit that reveals itself in the progress of music history also appears in the dynamism of a Beethoven sonata. This is Marx's take on Hegel's famous cunning of reason. Reason in history chooses its vehicles and its musical themes to reach its end. So the cunning of history is also a typical Hegelian thing. So who is Julius Caesar? Brutus is the instrument of the world historical spirit when he sticks the knife on the 15th of March into Julius Caesar, as is the first bar of Beethoven's thing. Even coming to itself in the world spirit. China plays a central role in Marx's theory of global music history because it was first in China, quote, that the sounds of nature were brought into a rational order. Remember he said that. Retained, used for rational artistic purposes. And yet these same naturalistic qualities mean that for Marx, the Chinese had not been free to develop an absolute understanding of music because their musical materials were not sufficient for reason to choose Chinese music as a vehicle for further progress. In other words, their musical culture was unable to allow them as human subjects to express their inner nature individually, free from the external dictates that rule the childlike religious phase of music history. They remained closed off from the cunning of reason and were thus of no interest to historians. In comparison, comes as no surprise, 1820s Berlin, the political capital of a new Prussia and the musical capital, in Marx's opinion, of Europe, was ideally prepared to take on the role of being music history's center stage, of being the place where the musical spirit revealed itself. The Prussian state, like ancient China, could foster a new music which would flourish there, in contradistinction to modern China, on the basis of a dynamic history and the self-improving drive of hundreds, if not thousands, of citizens, Marx's readers, who came together to sing the St. Matthew Passion with medals. I'll come to the final section of this talk. The German special path in music and musical scholarship, its Sonderweg, was paved with colonial bricks. Even if Prussia at the time had no overseas colonies, there can be no other word but colonialism for the division of the world into those with agency and those without. On a metaphorical level, Marx's writings set the tone for discourses of musical value in which German music was preferred to all other kinds. As Sanna Petersen has written of Marx's legacy, quote, the absence of non-Germanic music in the realm of absolute music is hardly an accident. And I can testify to the state of the world musical spirit in the mid-1980s in that room across the way, present company accepted, because we study German music. Boy, did we. Over the long duration, an additional consequence was the establishment of pseudo-colonialist frameworks in musicology, in which German and German-trained experts were colonized. For the colonized, success in this framework depends on the assumption of the perspective of the colonizers. In that sense, if I may stretch a term from post-colonial theory, many of us are subalterns in the colonies of German musical scholarship, although on the other hand, rather a few Germans I know distrust the hegemonist attitudes of Anglophone musicology, but that's another story. The colonizers for many years determined what did and didn't count as acceptable musical scholarship. In China, as far as I can see, the consequences have been equally profound. It took almost a century for German attitudes such as those I have described here to be put to productive use. As an important, very important recent article in Music and Letters by your PhD graduate, Joyce Chung, has shown, young intellectuals of the early 20th century, particularly in the May 4th movement after the First World War, such as the composer Huang Zi, validated the great works of the dramatic tradition, such as Mozart's Jupiter Symphony, by comparing them to elevated cultural products of Chinese antiquity. I really recommend that article to read. This approach, however, did not gain significant traction. Engagement with Western music in China has been shaped instead by the consequences of A.B. Marx's dismissal of Chinese music history as so much folklore. Anecdotally, I can say that when it comes to Western music in higher education in China, and in much of East Asia, the Hegelian A.B. Marxian paradigm, with a fair dose of Karl Marx thrown in for good measure in some quarters, is alive and well. And if you wonder about this, I suggest you have a look at a film from Mao to Moza with Eisenstein, and you examine the scene. I would have brought it, but it's a bit complicated. I want to put a film in the examine the scene when Isaac Stern is talking to the Chinese conductor Li Dulun through an interpreter. And Li Dulun speaks in the most Hegelian terms about Mozart being a product of the dialectic of the feudalist and bourgeois societies. And Isaac Stern, in equally Hegelian manner, says, oh, Mozart was a great genius who spoke the truth of the world spirit. It's very surprising. It's a very surprising passage. Decolonizing the study of Western music in East Asia would mean trying to understand how this came about. And what about elsewhere? Some difficult critical reflection may be in order. Forkel's fantasies about China remain of interest for the detail they add to the emergence of a German national music identity, mediated, as I've argued here, by a Chinese imaginary. But Forkel's cosmopolitan framework and intervention in the Holy Roman Empire's musical politics has little resonance today. Look over there on the shelf, you can get it on the mantelpiece. On the other hand, Marx's approach to China still matters rather a lot. Scott Burnham, a perceptive student of A.B. Marx, has written of Marx's legacy that, quote, our continued acceptance in the musico-aesthetic marketplace of Marx's defunct philosophical currency is an indication that such currency still buys us something of value, something no longer dreamt of in our philosophy. There's nostalgia in Burnham's observation, for sure. But in it, I read a warning about the continuing power of a national and political imaginary, Germany as nation of music, one might assume has long since lost its normative control over us. It is time to ask how much value is left in a defunct philosophical currency, especially when its circulation closes off engagement with so much of the world. The interrogation of the canon by the so-called new musicology of the 1990s and the partial rapprochement that followed between ethnomusicology and historical musicology were steps in the right direction, but they were not sufficient to decolonize musicology as a whole. On a more practical level, a new frame for the comparison of Chinese and Western, or if you will, German music history is necessary. We must, it seems to me, overcome our Hegelian baggage and restore historical agency to all the world's leaders. The task at hand was put forcefully by your colleague here in English, David Porter, in reference to literature, and I'm going to close this talk with his words. He wrote, writing China out of history was an act of instrumental amnesia, a deliberate occlusion of rival claimants to exemplarity and of the memory of a more truly cosmopolitan early modern past. A crucial task facing comparatists today is to historicize this act of forgetting, and in the process, to reconstruct the conditions of commensurability we need to resituate Europe, past and present, within an always already global frame. Thank you.